Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me. And welcome to all my fellow alums. Thanks for spending time with us this evening. I'm often asked just what exactly does a curator do? A curator is a keeper or a caretaker of a collection, managing record keeping, research databases, the proper storage and preservation of collections, even tracking the market to follow trends related to their collections. And of course, curators are the interpreters of the collections for which they care. Curators of art are most often associated with museums and are almost always specialists. My specialty is late 19th century American expatriate artists, and in particular, Gari Melchers. Belmont is the last resident of the American painter Gari Melchers, and as curator of the home and studio, I have at my disposal the largest collection of Melchers works anywhere, including dozens of preliminary sketches and studies that give me intimate knowledge of the artist's creative storehouse and his methodology. Okay, Mark, can I have the first slide? Another question I'm frequently asked, if given the choice, what picture would you have as your own? That's kind of a tough choice. Out of 1,650 items, I would have to choose the China Closet, the painting that appears on your screen, painted by Melchers around 1908. In terms of both technical mastery and commercial value, it's a premier Melchers. The painting's rich chromatic effects and the decorative play of light make this painting consistent with contemporary French Impressionism. And Impressionism continues to demand strong prices in the market. So that makes this painting one of our most valuable in the collection. The China Closet is set in the home of Melchers' American colleague, George Hitchcock, and pictures Hitchcock's wife working with her maid, Curie, to set a table for tea. While we know that Henrietta Hitchcock was a strikingly handsome woman, Melchers painted her on at least 2 or 3 other occasions. Here he has her back to us. The real focal point is the demure maid, Curie, who is presented as decorative an object as the glittering china she balances on her tray. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Oddly enough, for such an important painting, there are no preliminary sketches or studies to document the evolution of this painting, but photographs that the artist used to as visual aids in the painting of the picture do survive. And here are 2 on your screen. And if I also may show you, this is a stack of about 100 other photos, most of them taken by Gari Melchers to use as visual aids. And they're all housed in polyester sleeves to keep them in good condition. And we keep our collection storage area at a low humidity because of the fugitive medium that's suspended on the paper, photography paper. So it's supporting artifacts that, like these, that make our collection so important to the study of Gari Melchers. Now, the differences between the 2 photos reveal that all along, it was the maid's image that was critical to Melchers' vision. From the 2 options he gave himself, he chose to follow more closely the image on the far right. To enhance Curie's fresh and pretty appeal, Melchers painted her with hair highlighted in gold and outfitted her in an eye-catching lavender dress rather than the customary black livery that we see in the photo in the middle. And now for some of my other favorites. Next slide, please. We'll need to fix this. I don't see any slide. That's the next slide, number 3. I guess we can't do any better than that. Gari and Gari Melchers were themselves bitten by the art collecting bug, acquiring everything from Japanese woodblock prints to Flemish still life paintings and portraiture. Next slide is number 4. If you could select that. We cannot make it any larger. Thank you. Beautiful. One of my personal favorites out of Melcher's acquisitions is the charming double portrait of a lady and a young boy. They come to us from a bygone era. The boy is pictured in really tiny pointed shoes or slippers, and is probably in his first pair of trousers, although they're still fitted in the back with a drop seat for easy access. The mature lady very likely is his grandmother, and she appears in a fashionable empire gown and mob cap. Next slide, please. Let's see what happens. Yay! Thank you, Mark. It's a mystery how this painting came into the possession of Gari and Corinne Melchers. Was it inherited through family? Was it purchased from a dealer or an auction house? We'll probably never know. And we don't know who the identity what the identity of the subjects is, nor do we know who the painter was that painted the picture. If you look at the rear of the chair seat in the far right of the painting, and I've zoomed in for a detail on the right side of your screen, all we can make out is an R followed by maybe a V or a K, or it might even be a date. Even after conservation, it's very hard to read. In any case, it's very likely an American or French production and dates sometime between 1800 and 1810, based on the classicizing style of the costumes and the French directoire furnishings. No, I won't advance yet. The painting is a classic example of a portrait type called the conversation piece. Conversation pieces are usually small in scale. Ours is roughly 20 by 16. And conversation pieces typically reproduce images, informal family settings, or a circle of friends appearing within an interior, an intimate interior, and the intention of which is to reproduce likenesses and to commend the virtues and the comfort of domestic life. Hundreds were painted in the 18th century, and many of the figures in these paintings were stock types, although I hope our pair isn't a stock type, because I've come to regard them with great curiosity and affection. If they did once live, just exactly what can we find out about them? Grandmama is certainly genteel and handsome. She's also house proud, purposely planting herself in a handsome, well-appointed room, and expensive drapes, carpet, wallpaper enhance the beauty of the room, and she has other lovely things within her reach, like the glass domed clock on a nearby cabinet at the far margin, right margin of the painting. By the way, clocks were a common feature in conversation pieces as emblems of time. Clocks were the regulators of domestic life. And despite all the trappings, the lady's most treasured earthly possession must be this little boy with whom she speaks. And the cunning little boy directs our gaze to a book, which he balances on her knees. And I don't know what that book could be. It makes us curious. Is it a family Bible with a lineage, or is it something that a book, maybe a biography on the family? We don't know. Next slide, please. The lady and her little boy are viewing engravings of celebrated land and cityscapes. On the table nearby, we see that they're viewing them with the aid of a perspective glass, or vodoptique, also called a zogroscope, which you see in the detail on the right. A perspective glass is an optical device comprised of a convex magnifying lens and an angled mirror used to enlarge and to heighten the illusion of three-dimensionality when you're viewing prints. Next slide, please. Curiously, Gari and Corinne Melchers collected a couple dozen of these same kind of engraved views, some of which they displayed on the staircase in their house, where they continue to hang today, although we've rotated out another set of engraved prints. And I just wonder, it's possible that they acquired the portrait of the old lady and the boy because they were already interested in collecting the engraved prints, or did they collect the engraved prints because it was suggested by this portrait that came into their possession? We won't know that, I'm sure, ever. Next slide, please. This is an example of a perspective print. It pictures, I'm sure many of you recognize it, the Cathedral bell tower and Baptistry in the Piazza del Duomo in Florence, Italy. Engraved prints like these were really popular with late 18th and 19th century tourists, enabling tourists to bring them home as picture postcards, so to speak, to illustrate their favorite European palaces and gardens and church squares, even the interior of famous theater houses and concert halls like we saw on the staircase at Belmont. These were a form of novelty and entertainment that could be enhanced by perforating, in this case, many of the windows, and affixing colored tissues to the back to enliven the prints when you set them in front of a window or a candle. Undoubtedly eliciting the same oohs and ahs that we get from our visitors today. Unfortunately, I couldn't photograph the print backlit, so you'll just have to come to Belmont to take a look at an illuminated example. Let's see here. I will try to bring this up close to you because you'll see a slide of it in a minute. This is another item in our collection that I particularly admire, and it's so small, and I just wanted you to get a sense of its size. It is a diminutive plaster relief bust of a young woman mounted in an oval frame and a ribbon-wrapped mat. She's made of plaster of Paris and was cast from a mold taken directly from an original sculpted in clay. Now, if we could have the next slide, Mark. There we go, there she is. And next to her, I have a medallion. Intaglios and commemorative medallions were very common, such as the one you see to the right, based on the Italian Renaissance, which took its precedent from ancient Roman examples. They typically picture bust-length portraits in very shallow relief and in strict profile. This one pictures Gari Melchers' father, the sculptor, Julius Melchers. But our little lass in the empire gown and bonnet is reproduced in a form which we see much less often, in three-quarter profile in very deep relief, giving her more of the spark of life than we see in the example to the right. Unfortunately, we don't know who she is either, but it's worth noting that Mrs. Melchers came from it was a descendant of old Baltimore and Savannah families, and it inherited several family likenesses painted in miniature and dating to this period. It's entirely possible that this ceramic relief bust is yet another family heirloom. And I've read so many letters in archives exchanged between Mrs. Melchers' ancestors. And I have to wonder if this is the young woman who suddenly died of typhoid fever around age 12 or 13. It was a sad letter, and I'll never forget it. So it keeps me wondering. If you ask me what really excites me about being a curator, it would have to be the fun detective work. There are still so many questions that are unanswered about Melchers' body of work, like the challenge to locate lost paintings and separating the real Gari Melchers from copies or outright forgeries. And here's an example. Mark, if you could put me on the screen so that our viewers can take a better look at an example. This is a painting. Oh, this is going to be a challenge, I have a feeling. Melchers is known to have painted 2 or 3 riverscapes in his career. Somebody else was aware of that and had a taste for painting riverscapes and painted 5 or 6 more, affixing a fraudulent signature, a Gari Melchers signature at the bottom of them. Fortunately, every time they come up at market, I recognize right away that they're not bona fide Melchers paintings. A lot of innocent art collectors without my expertise don't realize that, and that's how I came to have this painting here. Somebody bought it and left it with me when they found out it wasn't authentic. Another challenge, back to my slide, PowerPoint, Mark, please. Another challenge, and next slide, please, is to sort out and identify some of Melchers' favorite models. It's a matching game that has been led by some of our good friends in Holland, Ron van Vleuten, and most recently, Carla Kager. There are lots of Egmonders who posed for Gari, and their families remember and have photographs of their family members and can say without doubt, you know, my aunt or my grandmother posed for this painting. And this is an example of one of Melchers' models. Her name was Gertje Zwart, and it is believed that she posed for The Girl with a Hat. On the left, which is now in the conservation lab, the photographs on the right were provided by Gertje's family, and I think it's pretty convincing evidence myself. Next slide, please. We also see that Melchers made Anna Decker, and that's a photo of Anna Decker to the right, posed as the mother in the Art Institute of Chicago's famed mother and child painting. Next slide, please. My happiest sleuthing exercise occurred over this little watercolor. And it's also seen over my right shoulder. Again, I want you to see, it's a fairly small watercolor painting. When I first saw it, it had all the indications of being a Melchers, a very early one, which I was dating between 1884 and 1888. It was sent to me by a Dutch collector who had just purchased it online. And he informed me that the dealer who sold it to him couldn't make out the signature. But this collector who knew a lot about Melchers said, I think it reads as Melchers. He had the painting sent to me without ever seeing it himself first, and to send it to me to get my opinion. I was almost certain it was a Melchers. And the setting is even the studio which Melchers shared in Holland with his American colleague, George Hitchcock. But I needed proof. After all, this also could have been painted by George Hitchcock. Gari and Corinne in the early days, Gari and George in the early days would often sit down together to paint the same subject, and their watercolor styles were nearly indistinguishable in these early years. But the glaring concern for me was the signature. It's not right. Gari Melchers did not sign his name in cursive until much, much later in his career. And it's not even spelled correctly. It says Melchers, it's missing the R. Melchers instead of Melchers. So I spent the summer searching for related sketches and studies to support my theory that it was a Melchers. I found a cryptic mention in some old records here at Belmont that Melchers had submitted a watercolor to a watercolor show in New York City in 1885. And I thought, that's early enough, but I didn't have a title. I fortunately got my hands on a magazine, Art Amateur 1885, in which appeared a review about this watercolor show. And I thought, what are the chances of finding in this review mention of Melchers, or even better, a description of my mystery painting? So the chances weren't very good, but breathlessly reading through the article, I came upon this quote: "We point in illustration to A Dutch Bachelor's Breakfast." Aha. By J.G. Melchers, and in the early years, he did sign his works J.G. He is Julius Garibaldi Melchers, after all. And it goes on, an exceedingly clever Hollander. He was often mistaken for a Dutchman. Notice how masterly was the way in which watercolor is made to do service in giving light to the teacup the bachelor holds in his hand. What substance there is in the figure of the picturesquely attired servant who is doing the offices of the breakfast table. So there you are. Melchers it is. And of course, I've concluded that the signature is not Melchers' hand, but was spuriously added by someone else, maybe the first owner or a later owner, who knew the value of a signed picture over an unsigned one. And so just inserted a signature for Gary in absentia. I was thrilled to be able to introduce a new painting to Melchers' body of work. And the owner was so pleased for me that he gifted the painting to the museum outright. And on that happy note, I turn the program over to my colleague, Jarod Kearney.
Right, let's see if that's working there. All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe. That was awesome. That was really, really cool. Let me get to make sure the camera's working and all the angles and all that stuff there. All right. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. That's really, really awesome of you. I want to start off by asking you folks at home to take a moment and look around yourself and look at the objects that surround you, okay? Look at the objects that surround you in your home. And I want you to imagine that it's suddenly fast forwarded 200 years, okay? You're suddenly 200 years in the future. What would those objects in your home say about you? They would say quite a bit, I would think, right? And that's the magic of artifacts. That's the magic of them. They're not just old things that exist only in our memory. They're phrases. They're human phrases manifest. And that's what we have here. They're right here. And so I'm going to show you some of the artifacts that we have here for James Monroe. And they tell a story, okay? They tell a story not just about James Monroe, but they tell a story about the early American Republic and the emerging American identity. What am I talking about? Well, let me show you. All right, I'm going to start off with something small, okay? Something really small. And I'll pull this up here for you. This is James Monroe's writing set, okay? Let me get my glasses on here. I'm getting old. All right, get my glasses there. Okay, so this is James Monroe's writing set, okay? And, you know, writing instruments of the late 18th century, they included quill pens, metal nib pens, graphite pencils. Well, these have both, right? This has a quill pen and it has a metal pen, okay? And you know how they make the quill pen is, you know, they would take strong flight feathers, right? And they would cut an angle and then they would cut a slit on the end. And the favored writing style of the time was called round hand, and that necessitated a really fine point. So you had to constantly sharpen the end of your quill pen. You had to constantly sharpen it. And that's where you get the pen knives from, okay? So it's kind of a cool little relation there. And then, as you know, the point to this end, quill pens, graphite pencils, although they were available in the late 19th century, they were often little more than sticks. And actually, I'll talk a little bit more later on about that. But what's cool about this is that if you notice letters written in more towards the Revolutionary time period, and then letters written more in the early 19th century, and then kind of going on, the writing style in the earlier days were a little bit more, fluid, a little bit more open, a little bit more, round hand, as it were. But as time went on with the quill pen, as the metal nib pens came into vogue, the writing starts to get, a little bit more concise, not quite as flowy, and you can see it if you look at the letters from back in the day. You can see the transition, and that's what's really cool about this tiny little object, is that not only did it belong to James Monroe, and it represents his writing and his, which I'll talk about in just a second, but it represents that transition between the old world and the old world and the emerging American Republic. It represents that transition because it has both. Not only that, but for James Monroe personally, he would have had something like this as he traveled around the district courts when he was in his early lawyer days. So it's kind of cool. You have sort of the best of both worlds in this tiny little object. And sort of on a side note, I looked up, people ask me about ink and what's the ink that goes into. Well, ink was actually a fairly complex recipe. And I looked it up. And here, I'll read you this. Let's see. A recipe for ink was Arabic, 3 ounces vitriol, 2 ounces gulls, 3 ounces white wine, 2 pints and a half. Beat the gulls, put them in the wine with an earthen vessel, set it in the sun for 6 days, stir them every day, twice or thrice, and sit it over a modern fire for half a day or a day. And then let it strain and dissolve some vitriol and gum. So there you have it. It was a very complex process. And that's what I love about this tiny little artifact, that it has sort of a representation of these different worlds. Okay, so let me move on here. Something else is a little bit small, but something that I love. I love this object. Now hold this up. Here's a glove that belonged to James Monroe. Okay, let me hold this up here for you. And this is it's constructed of doe skin, and this is a tan-colored glove that belonged to James Monroe. And although the letter's thin, it's finely crafted, the simple construction of the gloves makes it difficult to determine the date of fabrication, but it's likely, those 1780s, somewhere around there. And it was likely worn a tandem with the suit that I'll show you in just a second. It's kind of cool over here. So what? What's the big deal with this? Well, first of all, if you look at this glove, what's kind of cool about it is that it looks like something that you can just buy at Walmart, right? I mean, it looks like a modern glove. It doesn't look like anything that's, ancient or historical or anything. It just looks like a modern glove. And I love the fact that some things in history, they change drastically, and some things remain exactly the same. And this is kind of an example of this is sort of the same glove. But the other thing is that, America in those days, they were slow to embrace industry, right? They were a little bit slower to embrace industry. So they didn't have this massive tanning industry like they had over in England or something like that. But what did we have? We had a lot of natural resources, and for tanning and for gloves, what did that mean? Well, what do we have a lot of to this very day? What do we have a lot of? America has a lot of deer, right? And that's what this is. So this is made out of doe skin. So it's kind of cool because you have the story of like the sort of simplicity of design back in the day, but also it sort of represents how America embraced its natural resources. We went with what we had, and that was doe skin. Okay, so let me move on. All right, so this is pretty cool. I'm going to move the camera over a little bit so you can see. Let me just adjust this just a tad so you can see this fella. Okay, now let's see. I can get it over here. So this is the vest and breeches. Let me get it a little bit closer. You can see it. There we go. All right. All right, so the vest and breeches, right? It's wool flannel. and it's decorated with sequins. And, you know, it dates approximately to 1786, around that time period, the time period when James Monroe lived in Fredericksburg. And something that's interesting about it is it's sort of middle of the road. It's fancy enough, but it's not overly done. And what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about these sequins here. And let me show you something. I'm going to pull up a picture. I'm going to show you something here. It's hard to see them, but these little sequins, if I do a share of a photo, let me find this here. I'll pull this up. Okay. Here is a close-up. Can you guys see that?
We can indeed.
Here's all right, very good. So here's a close-up of a fiber-wrapped gold thread. What am I talking about? Fiber-wrapped gold thread. Well, what I'm saying is that the tiny sequences on there, the little flax on there, was actually delicately wrapped with this gold thread. I took my little nerd magnifying glass and I zoomed it in. And so it has this gold thread wrapped around it. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that it would have slightly glittered in the candlelight, in the sunlight. It would have slightly glittered, but it wouldn't have been crazy overdone. And that was very representative of James Monroe. Let me pop this up. His aesthetic was very, I'm enough to be in the room, but I'm not going to overdo it. I'm not going to be over fancy, sort of a humble dignity, I guess you would. And so this is sort of representative of that. You know, it's wool flannel. It's not bad, but it does have this gold sequins on it, but it's not overdone. It's not something that's going to be crazy and in your face or anything like that. And so that sort of tells a little bit of story about that James Monroe's aesthetic and what part of what he was all about. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. Let's fast forward. Let me see if I can find this here. I'm going to show you something else. Let's fast forward to this. And I'm going to pull up another photo here. And I'll pull this up. Okay, let's see this fella. All right. So this is James Monroe's court suit, okay? It was made of silk velvet, decorated with cut steel buttons. The suit belonged to James Monroe, and it was worn during his second diplomatic mission to France. Okay, so Monroe's suit, or his habit le français, as they say, was less ornate than the typical French court suits of the time, but it was still within acceptable standards for the French upper class. And the suit would have been appropriate for the court of Napoleon, which James Monroe attended. Okay, so if you look at that, all right. So what? What does that mean? Well, again, we're looking at a suit, and I'll pull up the actual one here in a second. We're looking at a suit that was enough to be in the room, and it was enough to be there, but it wasn't like, it was unique. It was for him in particular. And it was also sort of, in a way, represented that American aesthetic that we belong on the table with Europe. We belong with you, but we're not one of you. Okay? We're different. We're creating our own identity. And in my opinion, that this suit very much represents that. And let me pull this up here. I'll actually show you the real thing. It's a big fella. Let me see if I can get it up. Okay. There we go. There it is. It's very goth, right? It would fit in very time. Look at this. It's a silk velvet, which is actually very, very extraordinary. And something that I want to talk about in just a second, these cut steel buttons fascinate me. If you look at these buttons right here, they're not made out of rhinestone, okay? They're made out of cut steel. And what am I talking about? Let me show you. Let me pull up another picture here. This is really cool. All right, let me see. Let's see here. Get the share. Oh. Sorry about that. I'll get it in here in just a second. And okay, here's a close-up. You see that? There it is. That's a close-up of the faceted rivets that's on this particular suit. And what's interesting about that is that, you know, it wasn't jewels, okay? It was steel cut, and that was actually part of the Napoleonic era, is that cut steel buttons, which during the cut, they were actually sort of in vogue and they were popular in Europe during the time. So they would have meant for James Monroe to fit in. And the way that they do these is they actually, the craftsman has a base plate, and then he facets the rivets on there and then cuts, if you could look at it, he cuts individual rivets are facets on the rivets in order to create that sort of diamond reflection effect. So it gives the effect of a jewel, of a diamond, but it not actually is a jewel or a diamond, which is pretty cool. All right. Now let's talk for a second about Mrs. Monroe. Okay, I want to show you this. I'm going to pull this up for a second. All right. So this is a Nasser that belonged to Elizabeth Monroe. Okay, see that? So the Nasser, Etui, as they would say, it's in a cartouche shape. And let me open it up. It's sort of like the Swiss Army knife for ladies of the upper class. And what's cool about this is not just the Nasser, but what's in it. What do we have here? Let me show you. We have a spoon. Look at, can you see that? We have a spoon for the Nasser. We have an extension for a knife and fork. Here's an extension, and then I'll show you the knife and fork. Here's the fork right there. And where's the knife? Here, let me pull this up. And then the knife that they can put on a little extension for it. There's the knife. All right. And then when it starts getting, and here's where it starts getting fascinating. So what's this? Okay. That is an ivory slab that was used for note taking. And how would they do it? Well, they would do it with the little graphite pencils, what I was talking about earlier. So little tiny graphite pencils, they would write notes on here. In fact, that's kind of a good curator tip for you. If you ever buy a old ivory memo pad, look very carefully. A lot of times you could still see the notes that were written on there in graphite. And then I love this. Where is it? What is this? This is, in fact, if I can get it to focus, this is, in fact, an ear scoop. And I'm not making that up. It's an ear scoop. And they would use it to clean out their ears. And I looked it up, and people did injure themselves. That's right. So people actually injured themselves doing this. But there it is. It's a brass ear scoop for your viewing pleasure. Now, something else that's kind of cool about this, and Joanna was talking about sort of the cool detective work that curators can do. And in this case, something that we didn't know is that they make this style in both England and they make it both in France. And so we didn't know if it was English or French because there's no marks on it or anything like that. But when I looked closely at the measuring, there's actually a measuring stick on here, believe it or not. Look at that. Pretty cool. We got a measuring stick on here. When I looked closely at it, it was in fact the metric system, which means that it could only be what? French, right? It couldn't be, English wouldn't have used that back in the day. So there you have it. A Nasser belonging to Elizabeth Monroe. It has all kinds of cool stuff on it. Okay. Now, when I was showing you that course, and let me show you this. What I was talking about was the era in which James Monroe was in his diplomatic mission to France in the early 1800s. Let me show you this fellow right here, okay? There it is, yes. This is James Monroe's court sword. And this is not a rapier. A lot of people think this is a rapier, but it actually isn't. This actually is, they call it a small sword. And it was sort of the descendant of the rapier, so the next generation of the rapier. So again, you have that transition from the older world, the older 1700s into the 1800s. This transition time. If you look at it carefully, it's a cut steel, right? It's got that steel handle, steel pommel. It would have been 1060 steel going on here. They would have forged it in the tang. Would have gone all the way to the end. Okay, and so what? Well, if you remember that court suit that I showed you earlier, it kind of matches. You know, we don't know for sure if he wore this with that court suit, but it certainly has a similarity, does it not? And it also has that aesthetic of, it's not overly done. You know what I mean? Like, you know, you see a lot of court swords of back in the day, and they're really ornate. You think of the you think of the rapier in Princess Bride. You know, the jewel encrusted handle and everything. Well, that's not this, right? This is more reserved. It's more there, but it's nice. It's good, and it's good enough to be in the room. And the other thing about it, which is interesting and reflective, and tells a story of that time period, is that this steel is very much useful. Okay, It's got a point on there. So this could very much be used. So in many ways, the sword was a symbol of sort of like a Rolex, okay? Like where gentlemen would wear this on their side and, you know, kind of show off their status a little bit. But as a public figure, back in those days, it wasn't completely out of the realm of possibility that James Monroe might get into a fight, into a battle. And you know, it was not very often, but it was possible it did happen. And so there you go. They want to have something that is both reflective of who they are, but also could in fact be used if they had to. Okay, and I hope I have enough time here. I'm going to show you something else. All right. Around the same time period, James Monroe bought this set of dessertware. Okay. So he bought a set of dessertware, and it's silver, and it's George III. Okay. And let me see if I can put it up a little bit closer if I can. All right. It was made by Samuel Pemberton in 1805. Okay. And it was in England. And what's cool about this is I'm going to show you something, okay? So just remember this, but also I'm going to pull up a picture. Let me show you this picture. Oh, come on. There we go. Oh, all right. Can you see that? All right. That are the maker marks on every single piece that is in that knife flatware collection, every single piece. Okay, what does it say on there? You got the Birmingham 1805 mark. You got the Birmingham town mark. You got the English duty mark. You got the English sterling silver mark. Sterling silver means it's 92.5% silver. And you have Samuel Pemberton's maker's mark. So you have 5 different marks on every single one of these pieces, along with Monroe's Griffin symbol here. The Monroe crest, the symbol there. So you have 5 on every single one. And what does that say? Well, it tells us, you know, people think that bureaucracy is a modern thing, that bureaucracy is something new. No, bureaucracy existed for centuries, and they did it just as bad then as they do it now. And as the great Dr. McCoy said, the one constant in the universe is the bureaucratic mentality. Well, Dr. McCoy is absolutely right. They did it the same back then as they do now. So anyway, all right. So let me watch my time here. Let me show you this fella right here. Okay. So this is a walking cane. This is the head, or excuse me, this is the head of a walking cane. You got an eagle. And I'm going to pull up a close-up of this. Okay. See if you can see this. Hopefully I'm getting a little better at these. All right. There we go. Okay. So there's a close. There it is. There's a walking cane. And if you look at the incredible detail on that, I mean, the craftsman really took his time and he really did his thing. But there's a couple things that I want to talk about with this. One is the American eagle symbol. Okay. That's a whole wonderful story, which I don't have time for now. But basically, the short of it is that, you know, more and more folks in public office and just in general were adopting the American eagle symbol into their everyday materials. And you can see that a lot in the artifacts. Okay. And then also I want to show you, and I don't think you can really see it. Well, I guess you can see the picture on here. Oh, no, you can't. Let me show you this. Okay, I'll show you on this side. There's acorns on there. There's actually acorns. And what's kind of cool about that is the acorns, in my opinion, they look like swamp oak acorns, which is kind of interesting if you think about Washington, D.C., you know, built on the swamp, as they say. So that's kind of an interesting sort of little detail. But the other thing that I wanted to if you can sort of imagine for just a second, I'll tell you a quick story. If you can imagine just a second, something about walking canes, and gentlemen would be using walking canes, again, as a symbol of status, but also just something, you know, to sort of have, and possibly as a weapon, although not too often, but it did in fact happen. And on that note, I want you to imagine, okay, that you're a fly on the wall in this situation, and you're in the President when Monroe's president, you're in his office, okay, and in walks the Secretary of Treasury, William H. Crawford, and who visits Monroe, and he asks him about government appointees for some of his friends. Okay, William Crawford and James Monroe didn't really get along too well, and the president was, maybe sort of dilly-dallying on getting his friends appointments, and so when William Crawford asked the president about his friends' appointments, he sort of said, "Well, I haven't quite got to that to him," and William Crawford did not take that too well, and he kind of was in a surly tone, and so President Monroe, admonished him, and then Crawford, he came at him in a threatening manner with his cane, and so you can imagine if you're a fly on the wall of the office, you see like sort of these two old guys, well, they're not old, but they're older gentlemen, and William Crawford's coming at James. He has a cane, and he's coming at James Monroe, and he's like, with his cane, and he calls him an infernal scoundrel. Ooh, that's not great. And so, but Monroe, you have to remember, Monroe, he was a 6-foot war veteran. Okay, he literally had a bullet in his shoulder from the Battle of Trenton that he carried with him his whole life. He was no small guy with no experience. So, and he was in still relatively decent shape, especially for someone that age. And he gets up and he immediately goes over to the fireplace and he takes a pair of fireplace tongs and he pulls them out and he waves them around and he admonishes, Crawford and in his defense. So you can see this situation where William Crawford with his cane and James Monroe with his fireplace tongs facing off. It reminds me of that scene in Grumpy Old Men where they started fighting with fishing poles. So they're going to, well, luckily it sort of simmered down, and Crawford, he eventually apologizes, and President Monroe, who was actually a very gracious guy, accepts his apology. So anyway, I just wanted to show you this cane head and just show you a little story, one of the stories of James Monroe. All right, hopefully I have time. I think I have time for maybe one more item, I think. Let me show you this, okay? And I want to show you this. This is a whale oil lamp, okay? And you think to yourself, so what? What's the big deal about a whale oil lamp? Well, I'll tell you. There's some cool things about this. One is it's very representative of that time, okay, whale oil. The whale oil industry was kicking in during James Monroe's public life, especially, in the early and then going on into the mid 1800s, going into the mid 1800s. And there's a couple of things that sort of distinguish the whale oil lamp. One is they have a metal stem that runs down into it because the whale oil was a little bit more thicker. And so to have a metal nib go down into the reservoir would help keep the liquid a little bit more warm so that it could more fluidly go up into the wick. So that's something that distinguishes it. You also, in these early ones, you don't see a lot of the glass globes that are around them to protect. You don't see a lot of those. And then also they have this more bulbous reservoir right here. And then another thing that this one does not have actually is a lot of times just have two wicks going down into it. And so what's kind of interesting about this though is that it's, this is something that it dates to the period of around James Monroe's presidency. So it's something he might have had and could have had in the White House, but it's not overly ornate, is it? It's not crazy engraved. It's not overdone. It's sort of just middle of the road. It's just sort of, a nice lamp. And I think, again, that's sort of representative of James Monroe's aesthetic and his policy. And, you got sort of three kind of major things that come out of whale oil at the time. You had, the whale oil itself, which could be used for lamps and things like that. And then you have oil that was derived, we had oil that was derived from the blubber, which could be used for machinery and things like that, which very much helped into the industrial era. And then you had the spermaceti oil from the sperm whales, which would have been used in the whale oil. And then the other thing that they had was the whale bone, which would have been used extensively in, of course, corsets. for as time went on into the 19th century. Okay, I'm watching my time. I think that might be about all I have time for. So thank you very much for watching. This has been great and fun. And I turn it over to Jeremy, I think.
Yes. Thank you both. That was fantastic. We have a great collection of questions that I'd like to ask both of you. So Jarod and Joe, if you could both activate your cameras and your mics so we can hear you. I'm going to ask a few questions here. The first one is directed probably towards Joe. Joe, the question is, how involved was Gari Melchers in the affairs of Fredericksburg? Did he stay on top of issues in the community? Did he ever appear at local events to talk about his art? What can you say about that?
Can you hear me, Jeremy?
I can hear you, but I can't see you. Can you turn?
Yeah, it says the host has stopped my video.
Oh boy, let's see if I can fix that for you. How about now? Can you do it yet? There we go. I gotcha.
Okay, I've lost you, but oh, are you still there?
We are, yeah. Go.
Okay.
Yes, I'll read the question again if you like.
Oh, I'm fine.
Okay.
I really don't know if Gari was very involved in town. His neighbors certainly knew who he was. And I think over time he became better known because he wandered the streets of Falmouth and Fredericksburg to paint. He was inspired by small town life. And so he was known and friendly, although very reserved. It was his wife really that established a lot of the connections for him. She was involved in saving Kenmore and Stratford. And because of her involvement in town, Gari became unwittingly the host for a lot of important events, like when Prime Minister David Lloyd George visited in 22 and Calvin Coolidge. They hosted receptions for them at Belmont. Mrs. Melchers was far more involved civically, particularly with the Stafford County Health Association over the years. Gari was very involved with artist circles in Richmond. He was a founder of the Virginia Museum and was on the board of trustees at the Corcoran, but otherwise most of his activities were centered in his commercial headquarters in Manhattan.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is for both of you, and we'll start with Jarod. For both presenters, what's your dream acquisition for your respective collections? Jarod, what's yours?
Honestly, I would like to see smoking gun letters that said something along the lines of, I wore this particular sword with this particular suit, or, something along those lines would actually, because we know that he owned them. We know that it was the right time period, but, we don't know for sure that James Monroe would have worn this particular sword with this particular suit, things like that. But if we had smoking gun letter that actually says, that's what, hey, I have a cut steel small sword that I wore with, that would be ideal, something that really connected. Because, there's a lot of things that we have here that we know are the right time period. We know that, and we know for sure that they belong to Monroe. But we don't have, know for sure, like if they actually were used in the White House, or, if just because something was made around, 1820 and was owned by Monroe, it's likely they would have been in the White House, but it wasn't exactly in the White House. If we had a letter that said for sure, and don't get me wrong, we have plenty of artifacts that we know for sure were used in the White House, but things like that. So I think that would be a dream for me.
Cool. Jarod, while we have you, the next one is for you. Can you talk about the dress behind you? Oh,
yes. Okay. So this is Elizabeth Monroe's court gown. It's a Regency period or Empire period, whichever one you prefer. It's very much reflective of the time. In fact, there's a very famous dress by Dolly Madison that is a red dress that you see all over the place that it very much looks like this. For Jane Austen fans, there you go. That's about as Jane Austen as you get, right? It's silk velvet, okay? And it's really cool. Something that's really cool about silk velvet is, do you know how you make velvet, by the way? Let me show you something, just real quick, hopefully, if you'll indulge me. Let me show you something. All right. Okay, look at this picture. Okay, you actually have two, you have this machine, you have two weaves. Okay, can you see that? And then here, I'll get out of here. So you have two weaves of the fabric, and then you have a machine that cuts down the middle, and the velvet, that sort of cool velvet feel, is the frays that come from the inside of that. That's what that is. So you can imagine it would be quite laborious to make something like that. Something that's also interesting about this is that there's a possibility that she would have worn this in tandem with a gold netting. And in fact, there's a gold netting, that's a whole other story, that exists that we'd love to get our hands on. But that it would be possible with gold netting. Now, you're seeing this in fluorescent lights, okay? Imagine it in candlelight or whale oil light, okay? And imagine like a gold netting around it and the glittering that would have come off. It would have been quite striking. It would have been quite beautiful. So yeah, it's kind of a cool object there.
Very cool. Very cool. The next one is probably the most unique Mary Talks question I've seen yet, and I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say. This person asked, for a social studies assignment, my son had to interpret some modern artifacts completely wrong. He made a presentation saying Mario of Nintendo was a god of the Nintendo pantheon as evidenced by his image in books, games, and clothing. Can you share a story about an artifact, maybe in your areas, that was interpreted exactly incorrectly, either by you, hopefully not, or someone else in the field? Whoever wants to tackle that one, go for it.
Well, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I will say that Melchers traveled a great deal for pleasure, but he always took his paint box with him. And he had a very good friend, Charles McDonald, who was a golf course champion and golf course designer, who had a home in Bermuda. So he often was going to the Caribbean for his vacations and would paint the native inhabitants of the Caribbean islands. And so frequently collectors, dealers, and researchers assume that if they have a picture of an African American by Gari Melchers, because he did paint African Americans of our own community, that they are American subjects, when most of the time they're natives of the Caribbean islands.
Jared, do you have a, oh, Jared looks like he disappeared, like he might have.
Yeah, I was trying to look for it. There's actually a specific object. I don't have time to grab it though.
I knew it.
There are several things though. One, there's actually, I'm looking at, I don't know if, well, I better not turn the camera, but there's actually a little buggy over here that was interpreted as Mariah's childhood buggy, a little toy buggy, but it actually dates to it's the style of the 1870s, which, you know, would have been quite a time leap for. So yeah, we also have a harp over here that they said was a playable harp, but we actually have a harpist on staff who plays the harp and knows about these things. And she looked at it, I was like, no, it's just it's either just a facsimile of one or a toy one, or they got ripped off. So it wasn't exactly what they thought it was. So yeah, there's certainly examples of that.
Okay, Joe, I'm so sorry I cut you off and didn't let you answer what your dream acquisition was. What is your dream acquisition for your collection?
We have the largest collection anywhere of Melchers paintings, but we still have gaps. And so from the period of his marriage in 1903, well, I would say from 1900 until the time when he is working in Weimar, Germany. So the 10 years, 1900 to 1910, we are a little short on images from this period. And it's important to me because this is a period of transition for him. In an very early decade of his career, he was painting dark and homey, middle or working class interiors and everyday scenes of everyday life. But when he marries, suddenly he's much more interested in middle and upper class subjects, women, of course, in their sphere of influence, particularly with children. And so he all of a sudden brightens up his colors and he loosens his brushwork in the idiom that he was observing in Paris with the Impressionists. So I wish I had more examples from that period.
Interesting. Okay. We're going to stick with another Belmont related question. You had talked about how you have the most Melchers collections of anywhere. Where else can you find Melchers works? Are they commonly spread around? Is there some institutions that seem to collect them like you all do?
A good question. They're in the United States and Europe primarily. The best collections I will mention. I think it's worth looking for Melchers paintings in his hometown of Detroit, Michigan, at the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and those are some of the finest works by Gari Melchers. Keep in mind that I have a huge collection, but a lot of these are preliminary studies and sketches or didn't sell. So that's why they're still here. So the best is still out in places like Detroit. Chicago has a number. The American Museum of Art, called the Smithsonian or SAM Museum in Washington, has a rather large collection. Probably the seminal work comes to mind, the sermon, which is often on view. So those are the institutions that have the best selection. And then there are iconic paintings in various museums in Europe, but I would say stateside, Detroit, Chicago, and SAM.
Okay. I think we have more questions than we have time for. So at this point, I'm going to have to thank all three of you, including Scott, for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank Mark Simpkins from Events AV, who helped facilitate the virtual logistics of tonight's program. And thanks, as always, to our viewers at home for joining us and being a part of the conversation. Remember that this presentation will be available for viewing on the UMW YouTube channel starting tomorrow. There you can watch this program and browse the full catalog of Mary Talks. Our 5th season of Mary Talks continues on Wednesday, April 28th, with Dr. Christine Henry, Assistant Professor from the Department of Historic Preservation, who will present the history of roadside attractions. We look forward to seeing you then, if not earlier. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a great